My beloved child. Pause for just a moment, because what you are about to hear has been waiting for the exact moment your eyes found these words. Something changed. Not with a dramatic confession. Not with a perfect apology. Not with a message arriving at midnight. Something much quieter happened. And strangely, that quiet change may have done more than all the conversations that came before it. Your soulmate had been carrying a pressure they never knew how to explain. They cared. They remembered. They wondered. But every time they thought about you, those feelings became tangled with something else: fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of disappointing you again. Fear of opening a conversation they weren't emotionally prepared to finish. Fear that one message would create expectations they weren't ready to meet. And then, without realizing how much they needed it, you stopped pushing. Maybe you stopped checking. Maybe you stopped trying to understand every silence. Maybe you simply stepped back and allowed the unanswered questions to remain unanswered for a while. Whatever form it took, something shifted. And that space, that simple absence of pressure, became the one thing they secretly needed. They didn't understand it immediately. At first, the silence felt strange. One morning, they woke up expecting the familiar emotional weight. The room was quiet. Their phone rested on the nightstand. Sunlight had barely started pushing through the blinds. For several seconds, they stared at the screen. Nothing. No new conversation to avoid. No difficult question waiting for an answer. No feeling that they had to explain themselves before they even understood themselves. They picked up the phone anyway. Scrolled. Put it down. Then something unexpected happened. They felt relief. And almost immediately, they felt guilty for feeling relieved. Because relief didn't mean they stopped caring. That was exactly what confused them. If anything, with the pressure gone, thoughts of you became clearer. For the first time in a long time, they could remember you without immediately trying to decide what they were supposed to do about those memories. They could simply remember. A laugh. A conversation. Something small you once said. The way an ordinary moment with you had stayed in their mind much longer than either of you probably expected. There was no demand attached to the memory. No question. No decision. Just you. And somehow, that made the memory stronger. They got out of bed and tried to continue their morning. Coffee. Keys. Work. Traffic. The ordinary machinery of another day. But something inside them had changed. Later that afternoon, they were standing in a place they had been dozens of times before when a familiar song started playing. Nothing unusual. Nobody else seemed to notice. People kept walking. Someone laughed nearby. A phone rang. A door opened and closed. But your soulmate stopped. Only for a second. Because they knew that song. And more importantly, they knew what it reminded them of. You. There had been another time when that song was playing. Another room. Another conversation. Another version of the two of you. And suddenly the past was standing beside them. Not demanding anything. Just existing. They looked down. Their expression changed. And instead of immediately trying to distract themselves, they allowed the memory to stay. That was new. Before, memories of you had usually triggered resistance. They would change the song. Open another app. Start a conversation with somebody. Find something to do. Anything that prevented them from staying too long inside feelings they didn't understand. But this time they didn't run. They listened until the song ended. And somewhere during those few minutes, a thought arrived. Maybe the silence between us isn't asking me to escape anymore. Maybe it's asking me to understand. That thought followed them for the rest of the day. They tried to work. They answered questions. They smiled when they were supposed to smile. But underneath everything, the same realization kept returning. You had stopped trying to force clarity out of someone who wasn't capable of giving it. And now, without the pressure, clarity was beginning to find them. Don't skip this part, because what happened next changed the meaning of the distance between you. That evening, someone close to them noticed something. Nothing dramatic. Just a small difference. You seem lighter lately. Your soulmate looked up. They almost laughed. Do I? Yeah. I don't know. You just seem calmer. They tried to dismiss it. Maybe I'm finally sleeping. But the person didn't move on. They looked at them for another moment and asked a simple question. Did something happen? Your soulmate paused. They could have said no. Normally, they probably would have. But instead, they said something quieter. Something stopped happening. The other person looked confused. What do you mean? Your soulmate stared at the table. And for the first time, they admitted something they hadn't even admitted clearly to themselves. There was someone I cared about. I think I made everything harder than it had to be. The word surprised them as soon as they left their mouth. Not because they were completely new. Because they were finally honest. The person across from them didn't interrupt. So your soulmate continued. I kept thinking I needed more time. More space. More certainty. But I never actually explained any of that properly. A pause. And now? Your soulmate looked toward the window. Now they've actually given me the space I kept acting like I needed. The other person waited. And is that what you wanted? Your soulmate almost answered yes. Almost. But something stopped them. Because the truth was more complicated. I thought it was. That sentence stayed in the air. Then came the question that shook them. So why do you look sad when you say it? Silence. Your soulmate had no immediate answer. Because there it was. The contradiction they had been avoiding. They had wanted distance from pressure. They had not wanted distance from you. Those were two completely different things. And somewhere along the way, they had confused them. They had treated every difficult conversation as proof that the connection itself was difficult. They had mistaken emotional overwhelm for lack of feeling. They had assumed that because they couldn't handle the relationship properly, perhaps they didn't want it. But now, with nobody chasing them, nobody asking them to decide, nobody demanding an explanation, they finally had room to discover what remained. And what remained surprised them. They missed you. Not only the attention. Not only the reassurance. You. The specific person. The conversations that made ordinary days feel different. The way you noticed things other people missed. The small habits they used to pretend annoyed them. The moments when they felt understood without having to translate every part of themselves. And that realization scared them more than the pressure ever had. Because now they could no longer blame the confusion on you. Now the room was quiet. Now they had the space. Now the only person left to answer was themselves. That night, they drove home slowly. At a red light, their hand reached toward their phone. Not consciously. Almost automatically. They stopped. The screen remained dark. "Don't do it unless you mean it," they whispered. The light turned green. They drove on. But the thought didn't leave. When they got home, they sat for a long time without turning on every light. The room was dim. Their shoes stayed near the door. Their keys remained in their hand longer than necessary. Then they sat down. And memories started arriving. Not the dramatic memories. The smaller ones. Those were worse. A joke nobody else would understand. A message they once reread 3 times because it made them smile. A moment when you had asked whether everything was okay and they said yes even though it wasn't. A conversation where they could have been honest. And chose silence instead. That memory hurt. They leaned back. Closed their eyes. And suddenly they understood something. You had spent too long trying to interpret what they refused to communicate. You had been forced to read pauses like sentences. Distance like answers. Silence like truth. And maybe, just maybe, the healthiest thing you eventually did was stop. Stop guessing. Stop chasing. Stop trying to rescue a connection alone. Stop knocking on a door someone else had to choose to open. Your soulmate didn't experience that change as punishment. Not after the first shock passed. They experienced it as something far more powerful. A boundary. And strangely, the boundary made them feel respected. That surprised them. Because part of them had feared that if you ever stepped back, it would mean you had stopped caring. But the longer the silence continued, the more another interpretation became possible. Maybe stepping back meant you cared enough about yourself not to keep begging for clarity. Maybe it meant you cared enough about them to stop forcing a decision they weren't ready to make. Maybe it meant love did not have to become pressure. And for the first time, they could think about you without feeling trapped. That was the one thing they had secretly needed. Not abandonment. Not punishment. Not coldness. Space without cruelty. Distance without revenge. Room to hear their own heart. And once they had it, something began healing. They laughed more. They slept better. They became more present with people around them. But here's the part that matters. Their happiness wasn't coming from forgetting you. It was coming from finally feeling emotionally safe enough to face what they had been avoiding. There is a difference. A huge one. For several days, they did nothing. No message. No dramatic gesture. No sudden confession. Because real emotional change does not always announce itself immediately. Sometimes it begins privately. Quietly. In the choices nobody else can see. They started noticing their own patterns. The way they disappeared when conversations became uncomfortable. The way they delayed honesty until the delay created bigger problems than honesty ever would have. The way they convinced themselves that silence was kindness when sometimes silence was simply fear wearing a softer name. They began asking uncomfortable questions. Why did I pull away? What exactly was I afraid of? Was I protecting myself? Or avoiding responsibility? Did I expect them to understand things I never actually explained? And one question hit harder than all the others. What if they finally learned how to live without waiting for me? They stared at that thought. Their chest tightened. What if it's already too late? Fear returned. But this time, fear had changed. Before, fear told them to stay silent. Now fear showed them what silence could cost. A few nights later, they met that same person again. The conversation moved through ordinary things until your soulmate suddenly asked, "Do you think people can wait too long to fix something?" The person looked at them carefully. Yes. Your soulmate's face fell slightly. Then the person continued. But I think there's a difference between fixing something and telling the truth. What do you mean? You can't control whether something gets repaired. But you can control whether you finally become honest about your part in breaking it. Your soulmate said nothing. The words landed exactly where they needed to land. Then came another sentence. You don't always get another chance. Your soulmate looked down. But if there's something real you need to say, waiting forever doesn't make it safer. There it was. The line they couldn't escape. That night they went home with a decision forming inside them. Not yet courage. Just a decision. They would write down what they wanted to say. They didn't promise themselves they would send anything. That felt too big. They simply opened the Notes app on their phone. Blank screen. Blinking cursor. For almost a minute, nothing happened. Then they typed, "I owe you honesty." They stared at it. Deleted it. Started again. "I'm sorry." Deleted that too. Too simple. Too vague. They put the phone down. Walked to the kitchen. Came back. Sat down again. This time, instead of trying to sound perfect, they tried to sound true. I realize now that I kept asking for space without explaining what I was actually afraid of. They stopped. Read it again. Continued. You didn't deserve to be left guessing. Pause. Then another sentence. I think I confused being overwhelmed with not caring, and those were never the same thing. Their hands became still. Because that sentence was the truth. The major truth. The distance had not necessarily come from an absence of feeling. Fear had played a role. Poor communication had played a role. Regret. Timing. Emotional immaturity. The inability to say, "I'm struggling," before struggling became disappearing. The problem had never simply been whether they cared. The problem was whether they had the courage to face what caring required. And now they could finally see it. Maybe you've wondered about your own side of this silence. Perhaps you've replayed conversations. Maybe you asked yourself whether stepping back was the wrong thing to do. Maybe part of you felt guilty for no longer carrying the entire emotional weight of the connection. But consider this possibility. Sometimes when one person stops chasing, the other person finally has to discover whether they were running from the relationship or running from themselves. Your soulmate had reached that moment. They continued writing. They didn't write promises. No dramatic declarations. No claims that everything would suddenly be different. Instead, they wrote what they could actually stand behind. I don't expect anything from you. I don't know where you are emotionally now. I just don't want fear to keep speaking for me. They stopped again. The clock had moved past midnight. The room was silent. They reread everything. Then closed the app. Not sent. The next morning, they woke up thinking about the message. They considered deleting it. By afternoon, they had almost convinced themselves that contacting you would only disturb your peace. Maybe silence was better. Maybe the respectful thing was to leave you alone. That argument made sense. And in some situations, it may be true. Boundaries matter. If someone has clearly asked for no contact, that request deserves respect. But in the story unfolding inside your soulmate, there was no dramatic forbidden door. There was simply uncertainty. And they realized they were using uncertainty the same way they had always used it. As permission to avoid courage. That evening, another small event pushed them closer. They were cleaning through old things when they found something connected to you. Nothing expensive. Nothing extraordinary. Something most people would have thrown away without thinking. But they remembered exactly why they kept it. They sat on the edge of the bed holding it. And suddenly they remembered one conversation very clearly. You had once tried to understand them. Really understand them. And instead of answering honestly, they had changed the subject. At the time, it felt safer. Now it looked different. You had been offering them a door. They had been afraid to walk through it. They placed the object beside them and whispered. I should have told you. No audience. No performance. Just regret. But regret had finally become useful. Because it wasn't only making them feel bad. It was teaching them what needed to change. The following day, they returned to the message. Edited it. Removed sentences that sounded defensive. Removed explanations that secretly shifted responsibility. They stopped trying to convince you that they were a good person. Instead, they focused on being accountable. I know my silence probably created confusion. I can't change that. I can only be clearer now. Then they added something difficult. You giving me space made me realize something I should have understood sooner. I didn't need you to disappear. I needed room to stop reacting from fear. And I should have known how to ask for that without making you feel unwanted. They stared at those words. Their eyes became heavy. Because finally they could name it. The one thing they secretly needed. Space. But not because they wanted life without you. Because they needed enough emotional room to understand what life with you actually meant to them. And somehow, you had given them that room. Not by performing some perfect strategy. Not by manipulating them into missing you. But by releasing responsibility for a decision that was never yours to make for them. That difference mattered. Days passed. The message remained unsent. Your soulmate became frustrated with themselves. Every night. Open. Read. Close. Every morning. Maybe tonight. Then the fear would return. What if they don't answer? What if they've moved on? What if they read this and feel nothing? What if I waited too long? All possible. All painful. But another thought had begun appearing beside those fears. What if they never know the truth because I was too afraid to say it? That possibility eventually became heavier than rejection. And then came the night. Nothing dramatic happened outside. No thunder. No sign in the sky. No supernatural announcement. Just a tired person sitting alone with a phone in their hand. Finally understanding that courage often looks painfully ordinary. The message was ready. They reread it slowly. Their heartbeat increased. They deleted one word. Changed another. Scrolled back to the beginning. Read the entire thing again. Their thumb hovered above the screen. They almost locked the phone. Almost. Their breathing became shallow. Reach out. Then fear answered. What if it's already too late? Another pause. I still need to tell them. Their thumb stayed frozen. Then the final thought arrived. I don't want this story to end because I was too afraid to be honest. And something inside them settled. Not confidence. Not certainty. Acceptance. They could not control your response. They could not control whether the relationship had another chapter. They could not control whether too much time had passed. But they could stop letting fear choose their behavior. They pressed send. The message disappeared from the text box. Delivered. For several seconds, they stared. Their entire body felt strange. Part relief. Part terror. They stood up. Walked across the room. Came back. Looked at the phone. Nothing. Of course nothing. It had been seconds. They laughed nervously at themselves. Put the phone face down. 30 seconds later, turned it over. Still nothing. They decided they weren't going to do this. No staring. No refreshing. No turning honesty into another form of emotional control. They left the phone on the table. Walked outside for a few minutes. The air felt cooler than expected. They breathed deeply. And something happened that they had not predicted. Peace. Not because they knew what you would say. They didn't. Not because reconciliation was guaranteed. It wasn't. The peace came from something simpler. For the first time, their actions and their truth were standing in the same place. They were no longer saying, I care, privately while acting indifferent publicly. They were no longer expecting silence to communicate what words should have communicated. They had finally done their part. And that felt lighter. Hours passed. No response. Fear tried to return. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe they should have left everything alone. But they reminded themselves. Honesty isn't a contract. Telling the truth doesn't obligate another person to give you the outcome you want. So they waited. The next morning, the phone was still quiet. They went to work. A little distracted. A little embarrassed. But strangely, still calmer than before. By afternoon, they had begun accepting that maybe there would be no reply. And they told themselves something important. If that's the answer, I'll respect it. That mattered. Because this time they weren't using honesty as bait. They weren't saying the right thing only to get something back. They were learning that emotional maturity means speaking truthfully while allowing another person the freedom to respond truthfully too. Then, their phone vibrated. They didn't see it immediately. A few minutes later, they looked. Your name. They stopped. The room around them seemed to become quieter. Not because anything supernatural happened. Because sometimes one familiar name can carry years of unfinished emotion. They opened the message. It wasn't dramatic. No declaration. No promise. No, I was waiting for you. No instant reunion. Just a few honest lines. Something like, I read what you said. Thank you for being honest. I don't know what this means yet, but I think we should talk when we're both ready. Your soulmate read it once. Then again. And something inside them broke open. Not heartbreak. Relief. The door wasn't wide open. But it wasn't locked. There was a possibility. A conversation. Nothing more had been promised. And somehow, that felt more meaningful than fantasy. Because for the first time in a long time, what existed between you wasn't built on guessing. It was built on words. Careful words. Real words. Words with boundaries. Words with responsibility. Words that didn't promise what neither person could guarantee. That evening, your soulmate sat in that same quiet room. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't avoidance. It was space. Healthy space. The kind where two people can think without disappearing. The kind where feelings can exist without immediately becoming demands. The kind where possibility can grow slowly instead of being forced. They smiled. Not because every problem had been solved. Far from it. There were still questions. Trust doesn't rebuild itself because of one message. Past mistakes don't disappear because someone finally understands them. Communication doesn't become healthy overnight. If another chapter were ever going to exist, it would require more than emotion. Consistency. Patience. Listening. Boundaries. Actions matching words. And maybe your soulmate was finally beginning to understand that. They had spent so much time believing love meant certainty. Now they were learning that sometimes mature love begins with honesty inside uncertainty. I don't know what happens next. That sentence no longer terrified them. Because the next sentence could finally be, but I know I don't want fear making every decision for me. And perhaps that is why they seem happier in this story. Not because they've been handed the perfect ending. Not because destiny magically solved every problem. Not because anyone promised them another chance. They are happier because something inside them has become less divided. For a long time, one part of them cared, while another part ran. One part wanted connection, while another part feared vulnerability. One part wanted you to understand, while another refused to explain. Living like that is exhausting. But once you stopped carrying the connection for both people, they were forced to confront the part that belonged to them. And strangely, that became freedom. Your silence did not magically change them. Your boundary did not guarantee a transformation. People change only when they choose to face themselves. But the space created an opportunity. And they finally used it. Maybe you needed that space too. Maybe stepping back allowed you to remember something important. Your heart matters too. You cannot spend forever decoding another person's silence. You cannot build a healthy relationship entirely from potential. You deserve clarity through actions, not endless guessing. And if this story ever becomes real in someone's life, the healthiest version of it would not be "they returned, therefore everything is fixed." It would be "they returned differently. And I waited to see whether their actions matched their words." Because a message can open a conversation. It cannot rebuild trust alone. An apology can acknowledge pain. It cannot erase history. Love can create possibility. It cannot replace consistency. And perhaps that is the new chapter forming here. Not a perfect reunion. Something more grounded. Two people potentially learning how to stop turning fear into silence. Two people learning that space does not always mean rejection. Two people discovering that love without communication becomes confusion. And connection without boundaries eventually becomes exhaustion. Your soulmate looks at the message thread again. For once, they don't feel the urge to immediately send 10 more messages. They don't try to force the conversation forward. They let the moment breathe. They smile, put the phone down, and continue their evening. That is growth too. They finally understand that closeness does not need to be chased every second in order to be real. Sometimes the healthiest thing two hearts can do is move slowly enough to tell the truth. Maybe tomorrow there will be a conversation. Maybe later. Maybe the conversation will reveal that both people want to explore what remains. Maybe it will reveal that too much has changed. Either truth is more valuable than another season of guessing. And your soulmate finally knows that. Their happiness comes from clarity. From courage. From no longer hiding from themselves. From finally understanding what you gave them when you stopped pushing. Space to choose. Space to think. Space to miss without being manipulated into missing. Space to discover whether their feelings existed beyond pressure. And when the pressure disappeared, the feeling did not. That was the revelation. They cared. But caring was never the entire problem. The problem was whether they could become emotionally brave enough to act responsibly because they cared. Now, perhaps for the first time, they are trying. Not perfectly. Not dramatically. Just honestly. And somewhere inside that quiet honesty, something is healing. Perhaps this message reaches you while you are facing your own unanswered questions. If so, remember this. You do not need to chase an answer that another person must freely choose to give. You do not need to shrink yourself to keep someone close. And you do not need to interpret silence as proof of either love or rejection. Let action speak. Let communication become clear. Let time reveal consistency. Because the healthiest connections are not the ones where one person becomes an expert at reading another person's mind. They are the ones where both people eventually become brave enough to speak. Your soulmate learned that late. But maybe not too late to learn something from it. They once believed they needed distance from you. Now they understand they needed distance from the pressure inside themselves. And because you finally stopped carrying that pressure for them, they could see the difference. Tonight, somewhere in this story, a phone rests quietly on a table. A message has been sent. Another has been received. No promises have been made. No future has been guaranteed. But silence no longer controls the story. And for now, that is enough. Because some of the most meaningful beginnings do not arrive with fireworks. They arrive with two honest sentences. I should have communicated better. And when you're ready, we can talk. That may not sound like a fairy tale. But perhaps that's exactly why it matters. Real healing often begins quietly. Real trust returns slowly. Real courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply presses send. Then gives the other person the freedom to choose. Your soulmate has finally learned that love is not proven by holding tighter. Sometimes love becomes healthier when pressure loosens its grip. When both people can breathe. When honesty replaces guessing. When fear is acknowledged instead of obeyed. And when a person understands that another chance, if it ever comes, is not something they are owed. It is something they must honor. So the story is not ending here. It is simply becoming more honest. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about this moment is that nobody needs to know exactly what happens next. The truth has finally entered the room. The silence has finally lost some of its power. And two people, whatever direction their lives eventually take, may finally have the chance to see one another clearly. Some stories become unforgettable not because everything happened perfectly, but because two people finally found the courage to stop hiding behind silence. And sometimes, the one thing a heart secretly needed was never more chasing. Never more pressure. Never another attempt to force an answer. It was space. Space to breathe. Space to understand. Space to choose honesty freely. And once that space arrived, everything inside them began to sound different. The fear became quieter. The truth became louder. And at last, they were ready to listen.